Hi, and welcome back to the Fortify Your Brain Summit. I'm Betsy Schroeder, your host, and today I have as my guest Dr. Beth O'Hara. And Beth is a functional naturopath specializing in complex chronic immune conditions related to mast cell activation syndrome and histamine intolerance. She is the founder and owner of Mast Cell 360, a functional naturopathy practice designed to look at all factors surrounding health conditions: genetic, epigenetic, biochemical, physiological, environmental, and emotional. Her specialties are mold toxicity and genetic analysis in the area of mast cell activation and histamine intolerance. Welcome, Beth.
Thank you so much, Betsy. It's great to be here with you. And I think some of the things that we're going to talk about today might be a game changer for a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so you had significant health journey so far, including a brain injury that got you into this, right? So can you share some of that journey with us?
Sure. I was never as energetic as other kids. I just had all kinds of unusual symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
And they started when my family moved to the country into an old farmhouse. So I was over 100 years old. And I was so excited at the time. I was 7 and I thought it was going to be like Larnios Wilder, but what we didn't know at the time was the house was full of toxic mold.
Mm-hmm.
And also growing up in the country, playing outside all the time, I had lots of flea bites, lots of tick bites. So health started to decline. And then at age 9, I was kicked in the head by a horse. So it was feeding it crackers. It was an untamed horse. I shouldn't have been feeding it. And I turned around really fast. It reared up and came down right on top of my head. I don't even remember that part. I just remember waking up, sitting on the ground, and my bottom hurt so bad. And then I realized that my head was bleeding and I blacked out. So I was unconscious for quite a while. So I had that head injury and also was on the autism spectrum, on the high functioning end. So, back then, I'm in my 40s, back then, no one was really talking about autism. If they were, it was only the more extreme forms. Mm-hmm. And particularly where I grew up, I didn't even hear of autism until I went to college. But once I started reading the research on how it presents in women, it became very clear to me that that's what was going on in those younger years. So I had a massive amount of brain inflammation from that injury, from the mold toxicity, from things like Lyme and Bartonella, and eventually became so ill that I was bedridden for a long period of time, had horrific anxiety, had just a lot of difficulty even with social engagement and understanding what people meant and what their intentions were. So I had to work a really long time on all of that. So I can tell you my 40 plus years in life have been a huge journey of healing, and I've come a really, really long way, learned a lot along the way, but it took quite a while to find anybody. Well, I really didn't find anybody who could help me. I had to piece these things together on my own. So at one point I'd seen over 50 practitioners. And another piece I wanted to share is I'd had severe insomnia. And this went on for years. Took me very long, an hour, 2 hours to fall asleep. That deteriorated to where I would just drift. I couldn't really get into deep sleep. And the slightest thing, car horn outside, anything like that would wake me up. I had to wear earplugs. Things would still wake me up. So eventually I just couldn't even drift to sleep, and I became dependent on Benadryl for about 4 years, which is also not great for your brain. So there's been all of these things, and then this long journey of coming out of it and improving. And I can say today, very, very few people realize that I'm on the spectrum. When I tell people, they're shocked.
Yeah.
And I sleep very well, do have some maintenance to sleep well, but I sleep well. And my cognition is really good. I had really significant ADD. It's very mild now. And I run this practice. I was able to go to graduate school finally, kind of come full circle with the dreams that I had as a child. I wanted to go to medical school. And in undergraduate, I realized I was never going to make it because of my health and how ill I was. And so I had a full scholarship, which is kind of rare to get, and I had to turn it down. So it took me about 15 years to get to go back.
Wow. I mean, that is over the top. Oh my goodness. So then you have mast cell activation syndrome. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Like what are the symptoms, and how did you find out that you had that?
Well, how I found out was a very long journey of going to so many people. Very quickly, they'd tell me they didn't know what to do with me,
Yeah.
or they'd tell me they'd never seen anything like what I was dealing with. I had so many sensitivities to supplements, medications, and foods. And the worst was when people would tell me I was crazy, that it was all in my head. And I had that a lot, and I know a lot of our listeners have experienced that as well, unfortunately. But eventually I landed on Yasmina Kalenstom's site and her website. She was one of the first people that started to publicly report about mast cell activation syndrome. So I knew I'd had histamine intolerance, histamine issues. Then I realized the mast cell issues. And what this basically is on a very basic level is chronic inflammation. And it will present in a number of different ways depending on which systems are affected. So some of the classic symptoms are things like hives, allergies, digestive issues, runny nose, congestion, these kinds of symptoms. But I have people with mast cell activation that they don't have the skin symptoms, they don't have the allergy symptoms, but they have a lot of gut issues and they have brain issues. So it's a very common presentation. And anywhere where we have this kind of chronic inflammatory pattern, there's going to be mast cell activation because those mast cells are the frontline defender immune cells. So what they're doing is they're out there sensing, is there anything that shouldn't be coming into the body? Are there viruses? Are there bacteria, mold, or other fungal species like candida? Or are there chemical toxins? Are there EMFs? So our mast cells are fascinating. They've got over 1,000 receptors on the outside where whatever's happening in the environment can dock into those receptors and they'll go into action. Their role is to surround whatever shouldn't be in the body. Or if there's an injury, they'll be involved as well. And they create inflammation to isolate that invader, that pathogen, and then call to the rest of the immune system. So this is where we have a big link between mast cell activation and almost all forms of autoimmunity, because the mast cells are like the orchestrators of the immune response. And so if the orchestrator gets out of tune or gets overactive, which is what happens with chronic inflammation and chronic infections, chronic toxicity, chronic EMF exposure, these kinds of things, even chronic stress and traumas will trigger mast cell activation. Then they become hyper responsive, over responsive. I think of them like the guards of the castle gate. So if their job is to guard us, and you have a guard of the castle gate that has a constant onslaught of the things that we're all exposed to all day long now, air pollution, mold spores, EMFs, etc., then, and they never get a break, then they're going to start to get sleep deprived, if we're talking about a human being. And if anybody's been sleep deprived, which probably most people listening have been, then you know that your brain doesn't work right. You start to think strange things. Mm-hmm. Well, the mast cells, when they are on high alert all of the time and have to be active all the time, it's like their signaling gets disrupted. And so instead of just shooting at the enemies, very fine-tuned with a bow and arrow, it's like they have to shoot at everything. They start taking out the butterflies. They start taking out the citizens. And it's this kind of broad spectrum attack. But it's not the mast cells that are the problem. It's what's underlying that trigger them. Where this comes in with brain inflammation and brain issues is that there's a huge amount of mast cells in the brain itself. So anytime we are chronically low on sleep, whether we're pushing ourselves or we have trouble not sleeping, if we have chronic stress, if we have infections, we know about the gut-brain link. If we have issues in the gut, we're going to get brain inflammation. We're going to get this mast cell involvement.
Wow. So how common is like mast cell activation syndrome or histamine intolerance?
Well, let's talk about the histamine intolerance. So this part has to do just with histamine itself. So histamine is one of the mediators mast cells can create, but there's over 1,000 mediators. So there's also things like prostaglandins, cytokines. That's a word that now the general public knows.
Yeah.
And mast cells are one of the major cells that create those cytokines. And then all of the other kinds of things, interleukins and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But histamine is one of those mediators. It's the best known one by the general public. And that histamine, if just histamine is a problem, that'll be histamine intolerance. With mast cell activation, it's much more complex because we have all of these other mediators involved as well. But mast cell activation is estimated to be affecting between 9 and 17% of the general population,
Wow.
which is huge. It's, we're talking about 1 in 10, or maybe 1 in 8 or 1 in 7 people generally. People with chronic inflammation, my estimate is on the very low side. We're looking at 50%,
Oh,
if not 75% or more.
wow.
So the other big question is, why aren't more people talking about this? Why don't we hear about it? And part of it's because it's so complex, and because we get these various symptoms in different systems. People end up seeing a neurologist, they see a GI specialist, they have their general specialist, they might be seeing a dermatologist, an allergist, and we get all these specialists on board. It's almost like that old Sufi metaphor of the blind man feeling the elephant, and they think they have a rope, but it's the tail. They think they have a hose, but it's the trunk, or tree, but it's the legs. And not realizing that the connecting issue is this overarching mast cell activation, immune dysregulation. And so people end up seeing so many other specialists. But if we can dig down into what's going on underneath, what are the root causes, this is where people really see huge differences. And that's where my life absolutely changed, from being barely functional and bedridden to going back to graduate school and running a busy practice, and having a large online website. And I see that in so many of my clients as well.
So, what are some of the other symptoms of this? I know it can be all over the map. You mentioned the different specialists people go to.
Well, I really want to focus on, so I'll talk about some of the general ones and some of the other systems, and then let's really focus on the brain, since I know that's our topic here. People can have issues with diarrhea or constipation in terms of the gut, heartburn, acid reflux. There can be lots of supplement sensitivities. I mostly see that when there's mold toxicity associated with it, or Lyme and Lyme co-infections. Food sensitivities come into play. People start to have trouble eating certain foods. Probably everyone on the spectrum has mast cell activation, because that's a brain inflammatory condition. But when we're talking about the brain, mast cell activation can cause anxiety, it can cause depression, because mast cells are going to affect the neurotransmitters. There's something called mast cell rages that happen. And this is where the mast cells become so overactive, and there's so much inflammation going on that it just overwhelms the nervous system. And I've had those myself, and it feels like your version of the Incredible Hulk, and it's just hard to manage. I mean, it's just like all consuming. And there's a lot of people that, there are some people that definitely stir up their emotions, or, need to work on that emotional side of these kind of pieces for sure. Mm-hmm. But sometimes people really can't control that. And we're actually seeing a huge increase in things like road rage and lots of acts of violence. And it's correlated with the increase in environmental toxicity, in mold illness and issues, in EMF exposure. So those are some of the things. Insomnia is huge. Sleep issues, sleep cycle disruptions are very, very common with mast cell activation. And Sometimes I see some neurological issues in terms of the more broad nervous system. So things like tics or shaking or issues like that. Usually there's going to be a mold toxicity or an infectious component to that.
Oh, wow. So it's because of the increase of our toxic world, and the EMFs are the main cause of the increase in all this.
I think it's a combo of those and the rise of mold toxicity, mold issues. So mold issues have been increasing significantly since the 1970s.
Oh,
And
okay.
I've talked to a lot of environmental mold specialists about this and what really is going on. Why are we seeing that? So with the mold toxicity in the 70s, the building codes were changed so that buildings had to be built much more energy efficiently. So they're wrapped very tightly and you get very little airflow. And that wrapping traps condensation and humidity in the house. So anywhere where you have humidity above 50% or you have water for more than 48 hours, you'll get mold growth. And then another contributing factor that I've heard some people talk about is the fungicidal paints are killing off the weaker growing molds. And then they're not there anymore to outcompete the more toxic molds.
Oh, wow.
And then there's a bit of research going on right now about the effects of EMFs on mold. And particularly, there's been a study that was cited quite a lot where mold in a petri dish was put near a Wi-Fi router and grew 600 times faster. There are studies going on now to validate that better. But I have a very high suspicion that that's part of what's happening as well. So this is why I always come to these underlying pieces, because a lot of practitioners who are aware of mast cell activation are addressing it with all kinds of medications or supplements to just knock out the mast cell response. And the problem with that is then you leave the castle gate unguarded. So if you just take out the mast cells and take a bunch of antihistamines and mast cell medications, you're probably going to feel much better for a few months, maybe a year or two. And this is what happened with me. So at a young age, I also had severe allergies and hives, and I would scratch my skin till I bled and rub my eyes all the time and sneezing. And so I was put on a lot of antihistamines. And by the time I was 12, I was on 6 or 7 medications.
Oh, wow.
It really helped my symptoms. And I felt much better for about 3 years and then crashed really badly. And what happened was that the mold toxicity, the mold colonization, the Lyme, the Bartonella, the Babesia, there was nothing keeping them in check anymore. So this is why I'm so adamant about we've got to look and identify those root causes. And this is why I've written a root causes report that I have on my website that anybody listening to this is welcome to get. It's free. And it's just at our website at mastcell360.com/free report. And I go through all of these major underlying triggers. So if somebody has brain inflammation or these kinds of brain issues that we're talking about, you can step yourself through and see, okay, which of these has not been investigated for me and which ones do I need to deal with, and then take it to the practitioner so that you can investigate it in more depth.
Wow. So what are some of those?
So our major root triggers are going to be things like mold toxicity, stress. But let me start with the mold toxicity and talk about that a little bit more. This is the most common and biggest root cause I see in my practice. Over 80% of people in my practice are dealing with mold toxicity. And out of that, about 25% of those people come in and know they have mold toxicity. The other 75% have no idea, and they usually fight me on it. And then we get the testing and confirm that that's what's going on. But most people have no idea there could be mold in their home. And I'm extremely mold sensitive at this point in my life, and I will react within about 5 or 10 seconds.
Wow.
I have a really hard time finding places that don't have mold. Even if I go to a family member's home, a friend's home, a hotel, it's a huge problem that isn't quite on people's radar enough yet. So that's by far the biggest. Other chronic infections like Lyme and Bartonella, Epstein-Barr somewhat, but sometimes if we deal with some of the more underlying things, that will start to resolve. So we have just across the board infections, different kinds of infections. And I'm going to include mold in kind of an infection and a toxicity area. So then we have toxicity. And so this is going to be air pollution. A lot of people think that they're drinking really clear, clean water, but when I test them for chemical toxins, we see a number of them show up. And it's amazing what's actually in the water. And so water is a big source. Things like new materials, new carpets, new cars, new flooring, anything that off-gases, new kitchen cabinets. Or I get a number of people who just moved into a new home and then they got sick. So it's kind of building illness that goes on. So that's that toxicity category. Then we have, there's a lot of foods that can trigger the mast cell. So high histamine foods, lectins, oxalates. These are some of the categories that we look at. Once we deal with the underlying issues, those food sensitivities usually improve. We can also have food reactions to things like wheat or corn. I've had people that had antibodies to broccoli, to flaxseed. And so how would you even know, if you didn't go look for it? So that's one area. A lot of times that'll resolve also if you clear up the infections and the toxicity. Hormone imbalances are a trigger. And then stress and trauma are huge. And I always put it last because when I put it first, people tend to zone out and they stop listening. But it really should be number one. And even just day-to-day stress, we all live in a stressful culture. Just trying to drive from your home to the grocery store, if there's traffic, is stressful. Most people's jobs are somewhat stressful. Raising a family is stressful, all of these things. And we carry so much more stress than we did 100 years ago, 200, 500 years ago. So that's a big component. And then anytime people have traumas, whether it was abuse or a lot of people have medical traumas where they've been to practitioner and they were told they were crazy and they knew they weren't, and they finally started to think they were crazy. And I had those experiences. Or medical procedures can feel traumatic, especially for children. I have a child that had to have a spinal surgery at age 9 months old. And so he's got some medical trauma, and that's a piece. He's 5 now. And that's a piece we have to work on to help calm down his nervous system and calm down his mast cells.
Wow. Oh, wow. So, that's all encompassing, so many different triggers.
It's a lot. That's why I made that report, because I know it's too much for people to absorb all in one go. So people can download that, go through it over time and really take their time with it and then take it to their practitioner.
Yeah. So once they've kind of gone over that list and then they're like, okay, I know I've had exposure to these different things, but then how do they know if they have a mast cell activation syndrome or histamine intolerance?
That's a great question. So the first thing I have people do is try a lower histamine diet. And I've got a really good one on my website. There's a lot of low histamine diets online. Most of them are terrible. So they're just not well researched, or they copied from somebody else's that was missing some pieces. And so the one I have is based on the research that we have on histamines. It's also cross-referenced with oxalates and lectins if people want to look at those pieces. So if we reduce the histamines, and then we try a couple things to support the histamine degrading enzymes. So this would be like diamine oxidase that degrades histamine in the gut. You can take as a supplement. And then we have the methylation process is really important for helping to degrade histamine in the body. So if we support those, and huge recovery, so much better, then that person probably just had histamine intolerance. We do all of that, and the person maybe is a little better, but not more better. And we still have all of these mast cell related symptoms. Then we would probably look at mast cell activation. I come from a little different perspective on that. So the official diagnostic criteria was only developed in 2016. That was when mast cell activation syndrome first became recognized by traditional medicine.
Wow.
It was in the research process for over 20 years before that. And there were a lot of practitioners who knew, not a lot, I would say there were a lot of researchers and a few practitioners who knew that this was an issue. But that was when it finally got actual status. And the diagnostic criteria dictates that you have to have symptoms related to mast cell activation syndrome. And I do have a symptom survey on my website. People can go to the MCAS menu item, and it's right under there over at Mast Cell 360. And so they have to have those symptoms. Symptoms have to improve with some kind of antihistamine or mast cell stabilizing medication. Problem with that criteria is that those medications almost always have mast cell triggers in them in the fillers.
Oh no.
Or the dyes. So they almost always have titanium dioxide, or they have some kind of dye. They might have cornstarch. And a lot of people react to those medications and can't take them. You can get them compounded, and that would be the best way to try them. But some people can't do them at all. And then the other part of the diagnostic criteria is you have to have an elevation on one of the markers, blood or urine, or a bone biopsy, which is painful. Most people don't want to do that. But generally people are using urine and blood testing. Problem with that is these markers, so serum histamine, urine histamine, prostaglandins, the interleukins that can be measured, tryptase, all of these things. In mast cell activation syndrome, those mediators are going to be up and then usually back down within 15 minutes. You got to catch it in a little window. And some practitioners are having people come to their office and be there for 8 hours, have them trigger a flare by eating things they know that flare them or exposing themselves to things that flare them, which I don't think is a great idea. But if they need insurance coverage, what else are you going to do? And then they'll draw blood every hour on the hour until they get a positive response. Now they have a lab in house where they can just keep processing the blood, and the blood has to be chilled, the urine has to stay chilled. There's lots of lab errors that can occur. That testing I'm seeing is only catching about 10% of people with mast cell activation syndrome.
Oh, wow.
So this is another problem that we have, why this is so common and so under recognized. And that's just really encourage people to look at that, take that symptom survey on there and see if they identify themselves in there.
Wow. So once they figure out they do have mast cell activation syndrome, like what are the steps for getting better? I mean, where do you start?
Yeah, so the biggest thing is to know that there are lots of ways to improve. Okay. It is complex, and the majority of people will need a practitioner to step them through. But it's hard work. So I always tell people, if you want a quick fix, you're going to have to go the medication route. Mm-hmm. But the medication route does, like we said, have those issues where you need more and more medication over time, and then eventually that won't work. If people are really ready to do the hard work of actually healing, the first step is, in my practice, I do a root cause analysis. Mm-hmm. And I go through an extensive intake process and information gathering, look at all of these categories and see what may be going on. If there's mold toxicity, this is number one, the first thing to work on. And I should preface that if that's step one, step zero is actually working on the limbic system and parasympathetic nervous system. That's where I have everybody start. So I have them do things like, I love the Gupta program. I have them use things like brain tap. And if there's any vagal nerve impingement at the back of the neck, this is huge for causing immune imbalances, because the immune system and the nervous system and our hormone system are all interwoven. They're not really separate systems. They're really an axis. And that's how we should always think of them. So that's going to be the biggest step, to start on that nervous system balancing, stress reduction, if there's any abuse happening, getting out of an abusive situation.
And how do you have vagus nerve impingement? What would cause that?
Well, the head injury I had caused a lot for me. So that's one. Any kind of trauma, a car accident where you have whiplash, the vagal nerve comes out between the base of the skull and the first vertebrae.
Mm.
So if that first vertebrae, the atlas, gets shifted, it's easy for that to put pressure on that nerve, and some of the other cranial nerves that come out can get affected with subluxations in the neck.
Okay.
That has to be checked by a chiropractor or an osteopath, somebody who has advanced training in the upper neck. Most just regular chiropractors don't have that. It's kind of above and beyond that chiropractor medical school. So you have to do that additional training. But that's huge. There's actually a book called Accessing the Healing Power of the Vagal Nerve that has exercises in it that help people release that vagal nerve. And they're very gentle. Almost everyone can do them. So those are some great initial steps. And then cleaning up the diet. If there's anything inflammatory, working on those lectins and the histamines particularly. These are going to be the beginning steps.
Wow. So is that going to be a long-term thing to remove those foods, or you're just removing them until you're at a better place when you're healing?
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends person to person.
Okay.
So young people, especially children and teenagers, they bounce back so fast. They're usually done in about 6 months. And a lot of times they get a lot of foods back. Most people aren't going to go back to eating McDonald's and Pizza Hut and French fries and these kinds of things, especially on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. But most people should be able to get back the nutrient dense, fresh, higher histamine foods, higher lectin foods. Might have to rotate them. Or some people have, complete clearing up of their symptoms, and then they can live a normal life. It depends on the extent, depends on how much work people do, depends on how much they work on the nervous system. This is a hard one sometimes for me to get people to realize how essential that is.
Absolutely. Stress can do all kinds of damage. Oh, wow. So what do you do now to continue to fortify your brain and keep inflammation down and just to stay healthy?
That's a great question. So one, I make sure I always get a minimum 8 hours of sleep. And I actually try to get 9, sometimes 9.5 hours on the weekends. So sleep is so critical for the brain. So most fish oils are higher histamine. But there's one product called SPM Active. And I just saw Designs for Health also came out with an SPM product. So now there's 2 on the market that I know of. And this is so omega-3s in fish oils get converted to SPMs. Something in that process seems to make that lower histamine. And I don't know why. And I do have some people who can't do it. So not everybody can do it. But I do take that every day so that I can get those omega-3s, the SPMs really, but those pieces of my brain for brain health. I do meditation and breathing every day. I'm always engaged in problem solving because of my work, but I think that's really important to maintain cognition, to do something that engages problem solving. And I do also things like Bacopa, and I really work on my mast cell activation and any toxicity I'm very careful about, because I'd like to be around until age 90 or 100, but I don't want to be around at that age and be debilitated. I want to be in good health. I want to have my mind, and I want to be active and cognitively sharp.
Yes. All right. Wow. Thank you. A lot of great nuggets there that you shared. So where can people go then to learn more about what you do? You mentioned your website. Can people find you on Facebook?
Yeah, so website is mastcell360.com. Tons of great free resources. The free report is at /free report. The symptom survey can be found under the menu. And then on Facebook, we're at Mast Cell 360. And I do Facebook Lives for right now. I'm doing those every Monday. People can join. We always have a topic, answering lots of questions in there and working to get people up to speed on this information.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. A lot of great information, and I know people will benefit a lot from what you had to say.
Thank you so much, Betsy. I love that we can come together and help people with this stuff.
Thank you.